The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Boston Municipal Court's Room 4B, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Sarah Thompson settled into her chosen spot in the back row, perfectly positioned to observe without drawing attention. Her dark blazer and simple pearl earrings helped her blend in with the parade of lawyers and paralegals flowing through the courtroom. Judge William Harrison's reputation preceded him. 20 years on the bench, known for his swift judgments and what some called his old-school approach to justice. Sarah watched as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, thumb and forefinger pinching the bridge of his nose in what she would soon recognize as a telltale sign of his growing impatience. The morning docket moved quickly. A young white man in a pressed suit approached the bench for a minor traffic violation. Judge Harrison's voice carried a paternal tone as he reduced the fine, offering a gentle reminder about traffic safety. Sarah's pen moved quietly across her leather-bound notebook, documenting timestamps and exact phrases. The atmosphere shifted subtly when a Hispanic woman stepped forward to dispute a housing violation. The judge's shoulders tensed, his questions became clipped, and his patience visibly thinned. "Ms. Rodriguez," he interrupted barely 30 seconds into her explanation, "the code violations are clearly documented. The court's time is valuable." The woman left with an increased fine and slumped shoulders. Sarah's trained eye caught every microaggression. The way Harrison's gaze would drift down to his papers when certain defendants spoke, how his responses to similar arguments varied wildly depending on who made them. As a Harvard law professor specializing in judicial bias, she'd read hundreds of accounts of such behavior. Seeing it unfold in real time was different, more visceral, more infuriating. A young black man in work boots approached the bench next, hoping to arrange a payment plan for a series of parking tickets. Before he could finish explaining his situation, Harrison cut him off. "If you can't afford to park legally, Mr. Jackson, perhaps you should consider public transportation." The comment drew a few uncomfortable shifts among the court officers, but no one spoke up. Sarah's hand remained steady as she documented every word, every tone shift, every dismissed explanation. Her research team had selected Judge Harrison's courtroom after months of analyzing appeal rates and complaint patterns across the state. But numbers on a spreadsheet hadn't prepared her for the subtle mastery with which he wielded his authority. Just enough bias to be devastating, just enough plausible deniability to deflect past complaints. As the morning session neared its end, Sarah reviewed her notes. The pattern was clearer than even she had expected. Average speaking time allowed, frequency of interruptions, tone of voice, and severity of judgments all correlated strongly with the defendant's race and apparent social status. The data would be compelling, but she knew from experience that statistics alone rarely created change. That's when the idea first formed, a plan that would require perfect execution, and more than a little courage. She would need to experience Harrison's bias firsthand, to document it from the inside. As she gathered her belongings, Sarah began mentally preparing for her return to this courtroom, not as an observer, but as her own carefully crafted test case. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." As the room stood to attention, Sarah remained in her seat an extra moment, making one final note. Subject displays consistent pattern of preferential treatment. Recommend immediate implementation of Phase 2. She closed her notebook, stood, and walked out into the bright Boston morning, already rehearsing her role for the next act in this carefully orchestrated revelation. 2 weeks of meticulous preparation had transformed Sarah Thompson. Gone were her professional suits and carefully styled hair. Instead, she wore a modest gray dress from Target, her hair pulled back with a drugstore clip, and carried a worn leather bag containing carefully curated evidence of her landlord's negligence. Every detail had been considered, down to the slightly scuffed shoes that suggested someone who walked to work. The familiar halls of Boston Municipal Court felt different that morning. Sarah's heart beat steadily against her ribs as she passed through security, not from nervousness, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She'd spent 15 years studying judicial bias, but becoming living proof of it was something else entirely. Her case was scheduled for 10:45 a.m., late enough for Judge Harrison to have settled into his rhythm, but early enough to catch him before lunch made him irritable. She'd chosen her landlord dispute carefully, a legitimate complaint about chronic water damage and mold that affected several units in her building. The documentation was flawless, the kind of case that should be open and shut. Sarah watched as Harrison dispatched 3 cases before hers. A white college student received a warning for noise violations, complete with a grandfatherly smile. A Latino shop owner got a hefty fine for health code violations, despite his attempt to explain recent improvements. The pattern remained consistent with her previous observations. Case number 47B, Thompson versus Wellington Properties, the clerk announced. Sarah approached the podium, feeling Judge Harrison's gaze sweep over her. The subtle change in his posture was immediate. A slight stiffening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible downturn of his mouth. She'd seen this transformation dozens of times from the back row, but experiencing it firsthand made her chest tighten. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and educated, the first element designed to clash with his expectations. "I'm here today because my landlord has repeatedly failed to address serious water damage in my unit, leading to dangerous mold conditions that—" "Miss Thompson," Harrison interrupted, exactly as she predicted he would. "Do you have documentation of these alleged conditions?" Sarah pulled out her first exhibit, clear photographs of black mold spreading across her bathroom ceiling. "Yes, Your Honor. I have photos, inspection reports, and a complete timeline of my communications with the property manager." The landlord's lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably. He knew the evidence was solid, but Harrison barely glanced at the photos before waving them away. "Miss Thompson, are you current on your rent payments?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have receipts for." "And have you considered that perhaps your own housekeeping habits might be contributing to these conditions?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Several observers in the gallery exchanged glances. Sarah noticed the court reporter's fingers hesitate for just a moment over her stenotype machine. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The mask slipping just enough to reveal what lay beneath. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice steady, "I have documentation from a licensed mold inspector indicating that the source is a leaking pipe within the building's infrastructure, affecting multiple units. The property manager has acknowledged this in writing, but has failed to." "Miss Thompson," Harrison cut in again, his tone dripping with condescension, "this court's time is valuable. If you're unable to maintain your residence properly, perhaps you should consider alternative housing arrangements." Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with knowing her hypothesis was being proved correct, point by excruciating point. The hidden camera in her bag captured every word, every dismissive gesture. Soon, Judge William Harrison would learn the true cost of underestimating a woman based on the color of her skin. Sarah removed a blue folder from her worn leather bag, each movement deliberate and practiced. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she arranged her evidence in the exact order she'd rehearsed. Judge Harrison drummed his fingers on the bench, his impatience a percussive soundtrack to her preparations. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C, which shows the progression of water damage over a 6-month period." Sarah's voice remained steady, professional, a stark contrast to the judge's growing agitation. She had practiced this presentation countless times in front of her bathroom mirror, knowing that today's performance would need to be flawless. The landlord's attorney, Mark Davidson, shifted his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. His discomfort was palpable as Sarah produced a licensed inspector's report. They both knew her case was ironclad, but Davidson had counted on Judge Harrison's notorious biases to tip the scales. "Ms. Thompson," Harrison interrupted for the 4th time in 10 minutes, "we don't need to see every photograph you've managed to take. This court understands what water damage looks like." Sarah pressed on, her composure unwavering. "With respect, Your Honor, the sequence of these images directly corresponds to my documented communication with Wellington Properties." She reached for another folder. "I have here 17 certified letters sent to." 17 letters. Harrison's voice carried a note of derision. "Miss Thompson, perhaps if you spent less time writing letters and more time." "Objection, Your Honor," Davidson interjected, surprising himself. Even he couldn't stomach the judge's obvious bias. "The plaintiff's documentation is relevant to establishing the timeline off." "Overruled," Harrison snapped, his gaze never leaving Sarah. "Continue, Miss Thompson, but please be brief. Some of us have other matters to attend to today." Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing each word of the increasingly tense exchange. In the gallery, a young law student had stopped taking notes, too engrossed in the unfolding scene. "These letters," Sarah continued, her finger tracing the dates on each envelope, "demonstrate a clear pattern of neglect. The property manager, Mr. Wells, acknowledged the issue in writing on March 15th. She produced another document. As you can see, he promised repairs within the week. That was 4 months ago." Harrison barely glanced at the evidence. "And you expect this court to believe that a reputable property management company would simply ignore?" "I expect this court," Sarah replied, her voice carrying just enough emphasis to make the court reporter look up, "to review the evidence presented. The building inspector's report clearly states that the mold levels in my unit are 10 times the acceptable limit. 3 other tenants have filed similar complaints." The judge's face darkened. Nobody interrupted him. Sarah could almost see the thoughts churning behind his stern expression. How dare this woman challenge his authority? She had watched him handle dozens of cases, had documented his patterns, knew exactly which buttons to push. "Furthermore," she pressed on, producing a final document with practiced precision, "the city's housing department has cited Wellington Properties twice in the past year for similar violations in other buildings they manage. This pattern of negligence. That's quite enough, Miss Thompson." Harrison's voice cut through the air like a blade. "This court does not need a lecture on property management from a tenant who clearly—" Sarah maintained eye contact, her expression neutral but unyielding. Every interruption, every dismissive gesture, every biased assumption was being recorded, not just by the court reporter, but by the small camera concealed in her bag. She had given Harrison enough rope, and he was performing exactly as her research had predicted he would. The next few minutes would cement his fate, though he didn't know it yet. Sarah gathered her documents, preparing for the judge's verdict, a verdict that would soon return to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, looking down at Sarah Thompson with the particular brand of disdain he reserved for defendants who had wasted his time. The afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of disapproval around his mouth. Having reviewed the evidence presented, he began, though Sarah had noticed him barely glancing at her meticulously prepared documents. "This court finds no compelling reason to rule in the plaintiff's favor. Miss Thompson has failed to demonstrate that Wellington Properties has violated any terms of her lease agreement." Sarah remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her, the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 4B opened silently. 4 people entered, moving with quiet purpose to take seats in the front row. Among them was Dr. Marcus Chen, head of the State Judicial Review Board, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, warming to his topic, "this court finds the plaintiff's complaints to be frivolous and potentially malicious in nature. The court orders Miss Thompson to pay all associated legal fees, totaling $2,750, within 30 days. A slight murmur rippled through the growing audience. The amount was excessive, even by Harrison's standards. The landlord's attorney, Davidson, looked increasingly uncomfortable, shuffling his papers and avoiding eye contact with his client. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly hushed courtroom, "before you finalize that verdict, I believe there are a few relevant details that should be entered into the record." Harrison's face darkened. Ms. Thompson, this court has reached its decision. If you wish to file an appeal. Dr. Thompson. A new voice corrected from the gallery. Dr. Chen stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. Her name is Dr. Sarah Thompson, William. And I believe you'll want to hear what she has to say. The color drained from Harrison's face as Sarah reached into her bag, producing not another piece of evidence about water damage, but her Harvard Law School faculty ID and her credentials as the lead researcher for the State Judicial Review Board's comprehensive study on courtroom bias. For the record, Sarah stated, her voice now carrying the full weight of her academic and professional authority, today's proceedings have been documented as part of a 6-month study on systematic bias in municipal courts. Your Honor's handling of this case will be analyzed alongside 50 similar cases presented in this courtroom over the past month. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of this unexpected turn of events. In the gallery, phones had emerged, their cameras capturing the moment a prejudiced judge realized he had become the subject of his own judgment. I would like to note, Sarah continued, as Harrison sat frozen behind his bench, that my actual residence is on Beacon Hill, not in the Wellington Properties complex. The case presented today was carefully constructed to match the exact parameters of dozens of legitimate complaints that have come before this court, complaints that received similarly dismissive treatment when presented by minorities. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. Harrison's hand, still poised to bang his gavel and end the session, trembled slightly. The authority he had wielded so carelessly moments ago had evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of realization. Dr. Chen approached the bench, a thick manila envelope in his hands. Judge Harrison, this is an official notice of review. We'll need to schedule a formal hearing to discuss today's proceedings, along with several other cases that have raised concerns about potential bias in your courtroom. The tables had turned so completely, so irrevocably, that even the court officers were struggling to maintain their professional composure. Sarah gathered her materials with deliberate care, knowing that every gesture was now being watched with new understanding. By sunset, the steps of Boston Municipal Court had transformed into an impromptu press conference. Camera crews from local news stations jostled for position as Dr. Sarah Thompson stood composed at the microphone, her gray dress now a calculated reminder of the role she'd played just hours earlier. Our preliminary findings suggest a disturbing pattern of bias in judicial decision-making, she stated, her voice carrying across the crowd. Today's case was designed to match the parameters of over 50 similar housing disputes brought before this court in the past year. The only significant variable was the race of the plaintiff. Behind her, members of her research team distributed packets containing initial data analysis. Charts showed stark disparities in speaking time allowed, frequency of interruptions, and severity of judgments based on defendants' racial backgrounds. The numbers told a story that could no longer be ignored. Rebecca Chen from the Boston Globe raised her hand. Dr. Thompson, sources say Judge Harrison's fine was nearly triple the standard amount for similar cases. Was this consistent with your previous observations? Unfortunately, yes, Sarah replied, adjusting her glasses. Our data shows that when minority plaintiffs presented cases involving property disputes, they received fines averaging 2.7 times higher than those given to white plaintiffs in comparable situations. Inside the courthouse, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers, watching the live coverage on his desktop monitor. His hands trembled as he reached for his reading glasses, scanning through the preliminary report that Dr. Chen had left with him. 20 years of decisions laid bare in cold, hard statistics. The phone on his desk buzzed again. The fourth call from the Chief Justice in the past hour. Local news websites were already running headlines. Harvard professor exposes judicial bias in groundbreaking study, and judge caught in own prejudice. The setup that revealed systemic racism. Back outside, Sarah fielded another question, this time from Channel 5 News. Dr. Thompson, why choose such a personal approach? Wasn't it risky to place yourself in this position? A slight smile crossed Sarah's face. Sometimes, the most powerful evidence is experiential. We needed to demonstrate that even a highly educated legal professional could face dismissive treatment based solely on racial appearance. Judge Harrison's reaction to me changed dramatically the moment he learned my credentials, the same credentials he should have considered irrelevant to the merits of my case. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Sarah's team had set up a screen showing side-by-side video comparisons. Harrison's patience with white defendants contrasted sharply with his treatment of minorities. The evidence was undeniable, his bias laid bare in high definition. Our goal isn't to end careers, Sarah continued, her tone measured. It's to expose systemic issues that often operate below the level of conscious awareness. Judge Harrison's behavior isn't unique. It's emblematic of broader patterns we've observed across multiple jurisdictions. In his chambers, Harrison finally picked up his phone. The Chief Justice's voice was grave. "Will, this isn't going away. Dr. Thompson's research is bulletproof, her methodology beyond reproach. We need to address this head-on." As twilight settled over Boston, Sarah concluded her press conference with a statement that would be quoted in law schools for years to come. Justice isn't truly blind if the person dispensing it sees skin color before evidence. Today wasn't about one judge or one case. It's about ensuring that when anyone steps into a courtroom, they're judged by the content of their argument, not the color of their skin. The media coverage would continue for weeks, but the real work was just beginning. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from judges across the country, requesting access to her research methodology. The ripples from this single case were about to become waves of change throughout the judicial system. The story exploded across social media like wildfire. Within days, Dr. Thompson's methodically gathered evidence became the centerpiece of a national conversation about judicial bias. But it was the flood of emails arriving at her Harvard office that truly captured the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. "Dear Dr. Thompson," began one message from a public defender in Atlanta. "After watching your press conference, I reviewed 6 months of courtroom footage from our district. The patterns are identical. Would you be willing to share your research protocols?" Sarah sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of case files that had poured in from across the country. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Law firms, civil rights organizations, and judicial oversight committees were all clamoring for access to her methodology. "We're going to need a bigger team," Dr. Marcus Chen remarked, stepping into her office with yet another box of files. 3 more judges from Suffolk County have requested voluntary reviews of their past decisions. They're worried they might have similar unconscious biases. The most surprising development came from Judge Harrison's former clerks. 5 of them had come forward, providing detailed accounts of patterns they'd observed, but had been afraid to report. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic discrimination that extended far beyond housing disputes. There was this case in 2019. Former clerk Jessica Martinez testified before the review board. A black business owner presented identical evidence to a white plaintiff from the previous week. Judge Harrison dismissed one and ruled in favor of the other. When I questioned the inconsistency, I was removed from case assignments for a month. Local news stations ran side-by-side comparisons of Harrison's courtroom behavior, analyzed by body language experts and legal scholars. The subtle shifts in his tone, the frequency of interruptions, the dismissive gestures, all quantified and cataloged. The data was damning. What makes this study unique, Sarah explained to a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School, is that we didn't just collect statistics. We created controlled scenarios where all variables except race were held constant. The results challenged the notion that judicial bias is merely anecdotal. In his home, Judge Harrison watched the coverage with growing dismay. His computer screen displayed dozens of his past cases now flagged for review. Cases where he'd rule against minority plaintiffs despite strong evidence in their favor. Cases where his interruptions and dismissive comments now seemed glaringly obvious. The hardest part, he confided to his wife, is realizing I never saw it. I believed I was being fair, following the law. How many lives did I affect without even knowing my own bias? The state's Judicial Review Board had expanded their investigation to include 10 other judges with similar patterns in their rulings. Dr. Thompson's methodology was being adopted by court systems in 12 states. What had started as one carefully orchestrated case was becoming a movement for systemic change. Late one evening, as Sarah prepared to leave her office, she found an unexpected email in her inbox. It was from a Dunn Law student who had been in Judge Harrison's courtroom that day. "Dr. Thompson, I changed my dissertation topic after witnessing your case. Instead of corporate law, I'm now focusing on judicial accountability systems. You showed me that one person, armed with truth and methodology, can shake an entire system. Thank you for giving me hope that change is possible." Sarah smiled, thinking of the gray dress still hanging in her closet. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from dramatic confrontations, but from methodically exposing truth to light. The ripples from her case have become waves, and those waves were reshaping the landscape of American justice. The conference room on the third floor of the Suffolk County Courthouse had been converted into a temporary viewing station. Judge William Harrison sat alone, facing a large screen that displayed footage from his own courtroom. The blinds were drawn, and the only light came from the videos playing before him. Case number 342B. His own voice echoed from the speakers. Split-screen footage showed two nearly identical tenant disputes from different days. On the left, he listened patiently to a white defendant's explanation. On the right, he interrupted a black defendant 13 seconds into her statement. Dr. Thompson's team had compiled hundreds of such comparisons. Each video was meticulously time-stamped, annotated with behavioral analysis, and accompanied by statistical breakdowns. Harrison watched himself lean forward attentively for some defendants, lean back, and cross his arms for others. The patterns were impossible to ignore. "Would you like to take a break, Your Honor?" asked Dr. Rachel Martinez, the behavioral psychologist assigned to guide him through the review process. She sat in the corner, observing his reactions. "No," Harrison replied, his voice hoarse. "I need to see all of it." The next sequence showed him dismissing evidence from minority plaintiffs that was virtually identical to evidence he'd accepted from white plaintiffs. His tone, his word choice, his body language, all shifted subtly but unmistakably based on the race of the person before him. "I've spent 20 years telling myself I was being fair," he said, almost to himself. "That I was following the letter of the law." He paused the video on a frame where he was clearly sneering at a young black attorney. "How did I not see this?" Dr. Martinez made a note in her file. "Recognition is the first step, Judge Harrison. Many of these biases operate below the level of conscious awareness. That's what makes them so pervasive." The next segment showed his interaction with Dr. Thompson herself. Watching it now, knowing her true identity, every dismissive gesture and interruption felt like a physical blow. He watched himself wave away evidence that any first-year law student would have recognized as compelling. "Do you know what really haunts me?" He turned to Dr. Martinez. "Not just the cases we're reviewing. It's all the cases we haven't found yet. 20 years of decisions, 20 years of lives affected because I couldn't, or wouldn't, see my own prejudice." He reached for a thick binder on the table. Dr. Thompson's published works on systemic bias in the justice system. The pages were dog-eared, marked with yellow highlighter and personal notes. "I've been reading her research every night. The patterns she identified, they're not just about me. They're about an entire system that allows these biases to go unchecked." The video continued playing, showing case after case. Harrison forced himself to watch every minute, taking notes in a journal the review board had asked him to maintain. Each entry began with, "Today, I saw myself. The hardest part," he confided to Dr. Martinez, "is facing my colleagues. Some avoid me completely. Others defend me, which almost feels worse. They don't understand that Dr. Thompson did me a favor. She showed me a truth I needed to see." As the final video played, Harrison noticed something he'd missed in all previous viewings. In the background of his courtroom, there was a bronze statue of Lady Justice. Her blindfold, meant to represent impartiality, seemed to mock his every biased decision. "I'd like to schedule additional sessions," he said finally, closing his notebook. "And I think I'm ready to meet with Dr. Thompson. Not to defend myself, but to learn. There's so much work to be done, and it needs to start with me." The lights came up slowly, but Judge William Harrison remained seated, staring at his reflection in the now dark screen. The man looking back at him was someone he was just beginning to know, and more importantly, someone he was finally ready to change. 1 year later, the largest courtroom in Boston Municipal Court was filled to capacity. Judge William Harrison stood at the podium, facing a sea of faces: judges, lawyers, law students, and court officers from across the state. The occasion was the inaugural Conference on Judicial Bias and Reform, and he was the keynote speaker. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady but humbled, "I sat in my chambers watching a video that changed my life. Not because it showed me doing something extraordinary, but because it showed me doing something terribly ordinary, allowing unconscious bias to corrupt the very justice I had sworn to uphold." In the front row, Dr. Sarah Thompson sat next to Dr. Marcus Chen, both watching the man whose transformation had sparked a national movement. The reform program they developed together was now being implemented in 37 states. The easy path would have been resignation, Harrison continued. Many called for it. Some still do. But Dr. Thompson offered a different challenge: to become living proof that recognition leads to change, and change leads to action. He gestured to a screen behind him, displaying statistics from the past year. His own case reviews had led to the reversal of 73 judgments, where bias had demonstrably affected the outcome. But more importantly, the ongoing monitoring of his current cases showed a dramatic shift in his judicial behavior. "We've instituted mandatory bias recognition training for every judge in our district," he explained. "Not just a one-day seminar, but an ongoing program of review and accountability. Every decision we make is now recorded, analyzed, and subjected to regular bias screening." In the audience, Jessica Martinez, his former clerk who had testified against him, nodded approvingly. She had been appointed to head the new Judicial Review Committee, ensuring that no other clerk would have to choose between their conscience and their career. "The hardest lesson wasn't learning about my bias," Harrison admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "It was realizing how many people had seen it, had been hurt by it, but felt powerless to challenge it. Today, we're implementing a new anonymous reporting system, giving voice to those who previously had none." He turned to a group of law students in the back, their faces bright with purpose. "To the next generation of legal professionals, your task is even more important. You must be vigilant not just against obvious prejudice, but against the subtle biases that hide behind tradition, behind authority, behind the very structures we create to ensure justice." Dr. Thompson approached the podium when Harrison finished, carrying a thick bound volume. "This is the first comprehensive study of judicial bias transformation," she announced. "Judge Harrison's case is now Chapter 1 in what we hope will be a continuing story of systematic change." The most significant change wasn't in the statistics or programs, but in the daily operation of Harrison's courtroom. Regular observers noted his transformed demeanor, the careful attention he gave each case, the respectful tone he maintained regardless of who stood before him, the genuine effort to question his own assumptions before making each ruling. "The journey isn't over," Harrison concluded, looking directly at Dr. Thompson. "Every day, I discover new biases to confront, new patterns to correct. But now I have the tools to recognize them, the support to address them, and most importantly, the willingness to change." As the audience rose in applause, Harrison caught sight of his reflection in the courtroom window. The man looking back at him wasn't perfect, but he was evolving, learning, trying. And in that effort lay the real hope for justice, not in pretending to be free from bias, but in committing to recognize and overcome it, one decision at a time. The blindfold on Lady Justice's statue had been polished recently, gleaming in the afternoon sun. But now it represented something different. Not the myth of perfect impartiality, but the ongoing work of recognizing and correcting bias. Day by day, case by case, judgment by judgment. The hard work of true justice was finally beginning.